Good afternoon, teachers. Today's lesson, we're going to take a look at a lesson I do out of AP Macro Unit 5, which is the unit on countercyclical or stabilization policy. So today I want to isolate out and just take a look at expansionary stabilization policy designed to combat recessions and bring down the unemployment rate. So the first thing that I like to do with the kids is kind of go through the recent examples on the FRQs from the AP exam and take a look at how they've kind of clued the kids in that expansionary, either monetary or expansionary fiscal policy is going to be a part of the question. And as I went through the last, dozen years or so worth of FRQs, what I found was they generally don't tell the kids or clue the kids into this the same way twice. So what I went ahead and did here, because I want the kids to have seen it when they actually get to the AP exam, is I went ahead and wrote down a bunch of the different examples, both from the multiple choice, but predominantly from the FRQs, for how the College Board has let students know that it's going to be a fiscal policy, and specifically an expansionary fiscal or expansionary monetary policy FRQ or expansionary multiple choice question. So occasionally they're really, really nice, and they're just like, the economy's in a recession, bada bing, you're good. You know that you're in a recession. You should know, or the kids should know at this point, exactly what it is they're supposed to do. However, there's lots of other ways for them to word that, and more often than not, they don't flat out just tell the kids that the economy's in a recession. Rather, they give them some information that allows them to infer the economy's in a recession without actually telling them that piece of information. They make them work a little bit just to figure out what the question is asking. So other ways that I've seen this particular question posed, they'll say that the economy is experiencing a recessionary gap. That's almost as good as just telling them it's in a recession. They'll very often say that the economy is producing at a level below potential GDP. Sometimes, especially on the multiple choice, there will be a graph, in this case the aggregate supply, aggregate demand graph, showing a recession. So here's what a recession looks like. Our equilibrium point is to the left of long-run aggregate supply. And we know that this is a demand-deficient recession due to where the equilibrium point is. If this was stagflation, that would be a totally different situation. So make sure they know that recessions, by default, are caused by reductions in aggregate demand. A more recent one actually said that the economy was, quote, in short-run equilibrium with an actual unemployment rate above the natural rate of unemployment. So students need to know, A, what short-run equilibrium is, and B, they would need to know that if the current rate of unemployment is above the natural rate, then we're definitely experiencing some cyclical unemployment, and that is a sign of a recession. They've also said that there is the rate of unemployment is just above the natural rate, which is very similar to the one that was above. Occasionally, the multiple choice will tell them the economy is experiencing cyclical unemployment. If there's any cyclical unemployment, that's a clue that we're in a recession. They'll say that the economy is operating, quote, below full employment, which means to the left of the long-run aggregate supply curve. That's a good indicator. Every once in a while, pretty rarely, but I put it on here anyway, they'll see a Phillips curve, and so I've drawn here what a recession looks like in the Phillips curve so they can identify that. And then relatively recently, an FRQ started that the economy has an actual unemployment rate of 7% and a natural rate of unemployment of 5%, thus cluing in the kids that the actual rate of unemployment was higher than the natural rate, meaning there must be some cyclical unemployment, meaning we're in a recession. So if we get really lucky in any given year, the opening FRQ, generally this is FRQ1, we'll just flat out tell them they're in a recession so that they know what they're drawing. But more often than not, they don't do that. They're not quite as nice. And so here are all the ways that I've seen the kids be clued into the fact that the economy is currently operating in a recession. And that's also a clue that this is going to be either a fiscal policy, a monetary policy, or some combination of those two policies FRQ question. Next slide, let's move on to take a look at what the major problems that happen during recessions are. Okay, so this should technically be a review for the students, but I want to go ahead and make sure that we kind of call back to our business cycle lesson from like months ago and make sure that students understand kind of how we're going to define a recession and what are kind of the key economic indicators to look at when trying to determine whether the economy is in recession. So our primary problem that we experience during recession are high levels of unemployment, resulting in lower incomes across the board, lower levels of consumer spending, lower levels of investment spending, et cetera, et cetera. So we're not fully utilizing our productive resources, in this case in the form of human capital, because the economy is not working at full employment. in addition to having high unemployment, which is kind of the primary problem we're trying to solve during a recession, there's a couple of other indicators the students can look at to determine whether we're in a recession or not, including but not limited to a level of our GDP and productivity that is below potential. This is evidenced by the equilibrium point on the aggregate supply, aggregate demand graph being to the left of long-run aggregate supply. That's a surefire sign that something is wrong. We can also see very low or negative inflation rates, reminding that if we have a negative inflation rate, the term for that is deflation. So when people don't have jobs, they're not out there buying, and so we have reduced levels of demand pull inflation, leading to low levels or negative inflation if things get really, really bad. In addition, this isn't so much a problem as a solution, but it is something that's worth bringing up because one of the more recent multiple choice questions off of an exam relatively recently asked kids to know that one sign of a recession is that we're having increasing levels of government transfers. So those are those automatic stabilizers we began talking about way back in Unit 3. So you would see higher levels of government transfers in the form of things like TANF, unemployment insurance, Medicaid, and those things. As people during recession lose their jobs, their incomes fall, and more people will qualify for those social safety net programs that result in higher levels of government transfers. And then to coincide with that, also because of those automatic stabilizers and because of the progressive tax system, we would start to see declining levels of government revenue. So as people lose their jobs and make less money, they pay less taxes and the government revenues would fall. So this is kind of another clue for the kids that the economy is currently operating in a recession. So the next big point that we need to take a look at, and probably the most important of all of them, is once the students have figured out that the economy is in a recession, they then need to know what are the policies that'll work to counteract that recession. And theoretically speaking, this should all be review of Units 3B and 4B, but you may want to re-explain it anyway, especially 3B stuff, because it's been maybe a month or so since the students have heard that information, and it might be helpful for them just to hear it a second time. It can't possibly hurt. So if you got a little extra time, reteach this at this point, because it is super heavily tested on the exam. Basically what they're going to be looking for when they're asking students to counteract a recession or to lower the unemployment rate, or however they choose to phrase that, is they're generally looking for some combination of fiscal and monetary policies. So on the fiscal policy side, we're going to need expansionary policy, which is policy designed to shift aggregate demand to the right, have those positive aggregate demand shocks. And the two big policies that come up in the AP exam with regards to that are increases in government spending through the budgetary process, which is going to be made by Congress and the President, and decreases to marginal tax rates. The students will need to know why cutting taxes actually increases aggregate demand and gets us out of recession. The reason being they're going to have to harken back to Unit 2 where they learned about disposable income. So they should know at this point that disposable income is equal to total income minus taxation. So it's basically the dollars you have left after you pay your taxes. I tell my students, a lot of them have jobs that it's essentially their net pay on their paycheck as opposed to the gross pay, which is sometimes a much bigger number, and it makes them mad. So when we cut these marginal tax rates, we lower the rate of taxation, leaving consumers with higher levels of disposable income. And we can be relatively assured that if they have more disposable income, they're probably going to spend most of those additional dollars, most of those marginal dollars. And so higher levels of disposable income should result in higher levels of consumer spending and consumption spending. Now, also note, another piece of information the AP exam likes to ask them for is what will happen to the budget when we engage in expansionary fiscal policy. This will create budget deficits. So presuming we're starting off at a balanced budget, which is the way the AP exam generally asks this question, if we engage in either higher government spending or lower marginal tax rates, or more likely some combination of those things, this will result in budget deficits. You may want to hammer home a second time that this is a good thing. So you're supposed to run budget deficits when the economy is in a recession. Students tend to think that any deficit spending is bad, and they tend to freak out about that more than is absolutely necessary. There are times when it is economically appropriate to run budget deficits, and those times would be during recessions when we need some counter-cyclical policy. So expansionary policy runs budget deficits. It's basically it's some combination of increased spending and lower taxes. This is one way to get out of a recession. The monetary policy side of this is going to require what the AP exam sometimes calls expansionary monetary policy or easy money policy. Those two are synonyms for each other. They mean the same thing. And there's, depending on how you count it, either 3 or 4 different policies that pull together to make up this easy money, aka expansionary monetary policy. Option number 1, the Fed could reduce the reserve requirement or the reserve ratio. This is by far the least common thing that they'll do. In fact, they haven't changed the reserve requirement in well over 20 years at this point, because especially with your large multinational banks, going from, let's say, a 10% reserve requirement to a 20% reserve requirement would mean the banks would have to come up with literally hundreds of billions of dollars in additional cash, and it would just cause a major problem within the banking system. So in actual practice, they don't really change the reserve requirement, but it is one of the tools that they could theoretically use if things get really, really bad. The second tool that they'll use is changing interest rates. So one of the 2 interest rates they can change is the discount rate, which the Fed has direct control over. This is the rate that the Fed charges commercial banks to lend those banks money. In addition to lowering the discount rate, they can also influence another interest rate that they don't have direct control over, that being the federal funds rate. So they can target a lower federal funds rate, and lower discount rates have the exact same impact on the economy. They're both expansionary to the money supply, resulting in rightward shifts in the aggregate demand curve through a process we'll get to in just a second. Most commonly, the Fed tends to engage in open market operations. And so hopefully at this point, the students know that open market operations is basically the Fed's interactions with the bond market. In this case, if we're looking to engage in easy money policy to grow the economy, the Fed can show up to the bond market and they can offer to buy bonds. And so in this case, we're going to presume that when the Fed purchases bonds, they're taking dollars that weren't in circulation because they were sitting at the Fed and putting them in circulation through commercial banks, which will then make loans, and through the process of multiple deposit expansion will grow the money supply. So your 3 big monetary policy changes: lower reserve requirements, lower interest rates, be they discount or the federal funds rate, and the open market purchase of bonds, sometimes referred to on the exam as securities. Ideally, if we're going to do this, you want your fiscal policy and your monetary policy to work together. So ideally, if Congress and the president are engaging in expansionary fiscal policy, you would want the Fed engaged in easy money policy, or vice versa. That doesn't always happen. A lot of times Congress and the Fed will disagree about the direction of the economy, and this is because they have different interests, right? Remember, Congress and the president have to get reelected. It's in their interest to control the economy in a way that is politically popular, whereas the Fed, who are appointed and don't have to get reelected, are more interested in controlling the money supply in a way that is, I guess, technically speaking, more correct. So this would be that situation where there's a disagreement between Congress and the Fed that comes up to what we call the political economy, the difference in interest between Congress and the president and the Fed when it comes to making economic policy. All right, on the next slide, we're going to walk through what exactly those expansionary fiscal policies we talked about just a second ago look like. Generally, students will be asked to kind of identify and explain the appropriate fiscal policy, and then usually the next part of the FRQ asks them to draw one of 2 graphs. Most commonly, they're asked to draw the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model showing the effect of the expansionary fiscal policy. Occasionally, not super often, but occasionally they'll be asked to draw the Phillips curve showing the effect of the expansionary policy. So starting on the left-hand side, you'll see that I'm starting off with an economy already experiencing a recession at equilibrium point 1 with price level PL1 and level of our GDP as Y1. In the event that we either increase government spending, decrease taxes, or do both of those, that's going to affect 2 of the 4 determinants of aggregate demand. Changes in government spending is going to affect G, and changes in taxation is going to affect C. Either way, our level of government spending and our levels of consumer spending should go up, resulting in a rightward shift of the aggregate demand curve. And provided that we remember how to do the multiplier properly, we should be able to shift aggregate demand exactly back to long-run equilibrium. And this is the reason why knowing that multiplier is really important, because we have to know how much to lower taxes or how much to increase government spending. Otherwise, we might either undershoot and end up still in a recession, or even potentially worse, overshoot our level of expansion and end up creating inflation or hyperinflation in the economy. So that's no good. So if the students are asked an expansionary fiscal policy question, which come up more often than contractionary policy questions, and they're asked to draw the effect of that policy on the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model, this that we just drew here is essentially what that looks like. I'll tell you, having graded a bazillion of these, that the number one mistake students make when asked to do this is they will forget that the economy was starting off in a recession, and they'll always start off in long-run equilibrium, and then have a they'll know that aggregate demand shifts to the right, but if you start off at what we have labeled E2, if you start off in long-run equilibrium, they'll end up getting it wrong because that rightward shift in aggregate demand will create inflation and an inflationary gap, which isn't what we're trying to do. So if we're using expansionary policy, we're trying to close recessionary gaps. So you may want to point out, maybe draw the graph incorrectly on the board and make them tell you why that's wrong. We don't want to create inflationary gaps, we want to close recessionary gaps, meaning we're trying to get back to full employment but not overshoot that full employment. This may also be a good time to make sure that students remember the spending multiplier and the taxation multipliers from way back in Unit 3. On the Phillips curve side, hopefully at this point students remember that the Phillips curve essentially just does the opposite of what the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model does, at least with regards to short run and long run aggregate supply. So on the left-hand side, we're seeing a rightward movement along the short-run aggregate supply curve, so we should see a leftward movement along the short-run Phillips curve over here, resulting in higher levels of inflation and lower levels of unemployment, which is essentially what we would expect to see. So, depending on which graph they're asked to draw, this is what expansionary countercyclical fiscal policy looks like on both of those graphs. Make sure that you give them a whole bunch of different FRQs that ask them to do this over and over and over again, because it needs to be second nature to them, as this is one of the most heavily tested portions of the entire test. All right, on this slide, we're going to take a look at, I think, the more challenging half of countercyclical policy, and that's when students are asked to graph changes to monetary policy. So what we're starting to see here is that monetary policy, because its impacts are relatively indirect, the Fed doesn't have direct control over aggregate demand the way that Congress does through changes in taxation and changes in government spending. Rather, the Fed controls aggregate demand through making a bunch of policies that impact interest rates, and those interest rates will impact both investment spending from businesses and interest-sensitive consumer purchases, which will then in turn eventually impact aggregate demand. Because monetary policy is relatively less direct than fiscal policy is, graphing it out is a little bit more complicated, and kind of walking through the steps of what happens requires a little bit more in-depth understanding of all of the different models rather than just aggregate supply, aggregate demand, and the Phillips curve. So if we're engaging in an easy money policy, let's start up in the top left-hand graph, then we'll move right, then we'll move down from that point. If the Fed chooses to engage in easy money policy, the big change that they're looking to effect here is going to be an increase in the money supply. So we're going to be shifting from SM1 to SM2, bringing us to a new equilibrium point at a lower nominal interest rate. So this is going to be NI2 and a higher level of quantity of money being supplied and demanded at Q2. So easy money policy is an expansionary monetary policy, meaning it grows the money supply, and this is going to cause a rightward shift of SM from SM1 to SM2, resulting in lower nominal interest rates. Roughly at the same time, we're going to see an increase in the supply of loanable funds as well. And I think that this kind of makes sense, because if there's more money out there than there was before, because we've increased the money supply, then there should be more money available to be borrowed and lent in the banking sector because of that whole multiple deposit expansion thing we learned about in the last unit. So if we have more money in circulation, there's going to be more money in banks' excess reserves, which is going to result in higher levels of supply of loanable funds, hopefully driving down real interest rates from R1 to R2, and increasing the quantity of loanable funds being both supplied and demanded by the marketplace. Now, the important thing to note here is that on both of these graphs, the money market and the market for loanable funds, we're seeing reductions in interest rates, and that's really going to be the key to understanding the next part. So real interest rates are falling, and because real interest rates are a component of nominal interest rates are also falling. This is going to lead to increases in investment spending and increases in interest-sensitive consumer purchases, as businesses will borrow more money at lower interest rates because it's easier to earn a return on investment, and consumers will make large purchases when interest rates are low because it's easier to pay back their debts. These would be things like houses and cars. So, roughly at the same time, following the expansion of the money supply and the reduction of interest rates, both nominal interest rates and real interest rates, you're going to see roughly happening at the same time changes to the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model and to the Phillips curve. I'm going to go ahead and skip the Phillips curve for just a second and shift over here to the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model. We're going to end up doing exactly what we did in the previous model when we were doing fiscal policy. This time it took a couple of extra steps though. So we are still creating rightward shifts in the aggregate demand curve, resulting in new equilibrium points at a higher level of price and a higher level of GDP. Once again, if we've done our multiplier correct, we'll end up getting back to full employment without undershooting it or overshooting it. And then, since we're seeing that rightward movement along the short-run aggregate supply curve, we're then going to see a leftward movement along the the short-run Phillips curve here. So we're going to see essentially the exact same thing happen at the end of the day. So aggregate supply, aggregate demand is going to do the same thing that it did when there was fiscal policy, and the Phillips curve is going to do the same thing that there was coming from fiscal policy. But we have two additional models that we need to use to explain why those changes to aggregate supply, aggregate demand and the Phillips curve are happening. In this case, the linchpin to understanding why monetary policy affects aggregate demand is understanding that monetary policy affects interest rates, and that interest rates affect investment spending and interest-sensitive consumer spending. That's the key to this whole section. All right, thank you all for sticking with me through this review of countercyclical policy. The last thing that I want to do, and this is something that fairly commonly shows up on the AP exams FRQ section, is they'll try and throw the kids a bit of a curveball, and they'll ask, all right, so we're in a recession, and usually they'll ask either a fiscal or a monetary policy question to kind of start off the FRQ, and then either halfway through or toward the end of the FRQ, they'll then ask the students to draw, okay, well, what happens if there's no fiscal and monetary policy action? Sometimes it says like in the absence of fiscal and monetary policy, or they'll say, the government of country X, whatever one we're looking at, decides not to pursue changes to fiscal and monetary policy, or something to that basic effect. And they'll ask the students, well, what's going to happen if we're in that exact same recession as we were before, but what happens if we don't get expansionary fiscal and easy money monetary policy? What will the economy do if you just leave it by itself and leave it to its own devices? And so what we're going to attempt to draw here is we're going to try and show exactly what occurs. And basically the short answer is, like always, the economy makes its way back to long-run equilibrium all by itself, which is one of those opening rules we learn in this course in like the very first or second day of the course. Markets move toward equilibrium. The question is, what does that move toward equilibrium look like? And that's going to be the subject of our long answer. So before I start drawing on here, I want to explain exactly what I've got so that we're all on the same page here. So what I'm showing is the economy starting off in long-run equilibrium at equilibrium point 1, and then experiencing a recession. So the recession that we were talking about earlier on this graph is equilibrium point 2. We've seen reductions in aggregate demand resulting in lower aggregate prices and lower levels of real GDP. We can also tell that the level of real GDP is below potential GDP, so we know that we've got a recessionary gap, and we can infer from this that the current level of unemployment is above the natural rate of unemployment, as GDP and the unemployment rate have an inverse relationship to each other. Now the question then becomes, usually in this situation, we'd create fiscal and monetary policy that would shift us back from AD2 back to AD1 where we started, hopefully back in long-run equilibrium at what is labeled here equilibrium point 1. However, in these types of questions, and this is fairly common, the AP exam will say, okay, so there's no discretionary fiscal or monetary policy, we're not going to have any countercyclical policy, what's going to happen? And so to answer this question, students need to understand the relationship between the short run and the long run on the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model. they should hopefully know at this point that wages and production costs in the short run are sticky, and in the long run they are flexible. So what we've seen in our initial shift from E1 to E2 is prices are falling in this economy, but because we're in the short run, wages are sticky. Now, workers are going to get really excited about this because their nominal wages are staying the same while the price of goods and services either increases less than it was before, as is the case with disinflation, or the price of goods and services actually declines, as would be the case if we were experiencing deflation. So these workers' hourly wages, their nominal wages are staying the same, prices of goods and services are falling, increasing workers' buying power. This is kind of the opposite of what we see when we have inflationary spirals. So workers are getting really excited. However, in order for the economy to move back to long-run equilibrium, remember, at long-run aggregate supply, wages and production costs are flexible, which means generally that those wages and production costs will catch up with inflation and nominal wages will go up when we shift to the long-run aggregate supply curve. But in this particular example, because prices aren't going up, they're actually going down. When we move back to long-run equilibrium, provided the government doesn't intervene here, we're actually going to see nominal wages fall to keep in line with the reduction of prices that we saw in our shift from equilibrium point 1 to equilibrium point 2. And when those nominal wages fall, yes, it's going to make the workers really sad, but it's going to make producers, who we really care about for this particular part of the question, really happy, because remember, nominal wages is one of the determinants of the short-run aggregate supply curve. So what we're going to see is if the economy is allowed to move back to equilibrium all on its own, we're going to see a shift in the short-run aggregate supply curve from SRAS 1 to SRAS 2. And this rightward shift, this increase in short-run aggregate supply, is being caused by the decrease in nominal wages. So we'll end up going from equilibrium point 2 back to long-run equilibrium at E3, but we'll be back to equilibrium at a level of lower prices and lower nominal wages for these workers. Now, their buying power hasn't actually changed compared to where we were at E1. They can still buy the same number of goods and services that they could before, but the number of dollars they're earning has fallen. So if there is no countercyclical policy and the economy is allowed to adjust for inflation on its own, in this case, because prices are falling, when it adjusts, those nominal wages and production costs are going to fall as well, increasing the level of short-run aggregate supply and bringing us back to long-run equilibrium at the same level of buying power, but at both lower nominal prices and lower nominal wages to compensate for those lower prices. Hopefully this is helpful. Thank you very much, and I'll see you in the next video.